Welcome back to the Black Revolutionaries podcast. This is our last and final episode, episode 6. And in the first 5 episodes, we explored the different knowledge created and known about Black people and their bodies. From the beginning of racial theory, Black people have been considered anything other than human, sometimes beneath, sometimes above, but hardly ever human. The original theories of Black bodies being incompetent and unfit to take care of themselves, hypersexual, lazy, and greedy, have persisted and developed into social stigmas that justify the colonization, discrimination, and murder of Black people. I want to ask, what are the results of these images and stigmas? And what role did they play in the destruction of Black communities and identity through violence, policy, and medicine? So, we've talked about Francis Bernier and his fellow theorists' comparisons of Black people to apes and their exaggerated sexual images of Black women. We've talked about Sarah Baartman and how her body was a playground and spectacle for white men. And we've talked about the current brutality of Black bodies that parallels these earlier stories. I want to start at the beginning and explore how the racial theories that were created about Black people played a role in medical experimentation. And to start, we're going to dive in with Medical Apartheid by Harriet A. Washington. Washington quotes the Scientific American that once stated that the Congo pygmies are small ape-like elfish creatures that closely parallel the brownies and goblins of our fairy tales. They live in dense, tangled forests in absolute savagery, while they exhibit many ape-like features in their bodies. And after reading Sabrina Strings, the racial origins of fat phobia, I thought that these theories seemed kind of almost like they were made for fun. They were made literally with no thought, just kind of creative fun. And reading this quote proves that they literally did see Black people as something of the unordinary. It wasn't just that they saw something strange or unattractive or just different from themselves, but they needed to paint a picture and write stories about it, like it was a fun little fairy tale. But it wasn't ignorance. It was not. They knew that if they created images of Black people like these, they could justify the enslavement and colonization, which they saw as available and necessary rewards to take from Black bodies in the 17th and 18th centuries. And in order for Europe to be able to effectively build the superpower countries that it did, there needed to be justification to steal bodies and steal resources from Africa. And that justification was that African people were simply a lower species that needed to be managed by the white man. And in fact, freedom has always been a major point of tension between white and Black people. So, doctors during the days of chattel slavery claimed that freedom for a Black person was dangerous. And it was dangerous to the white public and for the slaves themselves, because the slaves were carrying disease and they would get people sick, but also because Black people were built for slavery. In the free, they would perish. And public health researchers in 1890 predicted that the Black population would go extinct by 2000. And so Black people were denied life insurance at the time. And for a while, actually. And Washington talks about a man named John Patterson, who was a black man who was suffering from some kind of mental illness. And honestly, in the story, it unfortunately doesn't even matter what he was suffering with, because Dr. Peter Bryce gave him the diagnosis of freedom. He didn't investigate why he was having the symptoms that he was having. He just simply gave him the diagnosis of freedom. Yes, he was diagnosed with being free. That was his ailment, freedom. But there's a contradiction that needs to be addressed, because how were black people considered incapable of taking care of themselves, yet were very much capable of taking care of the white man's children, maintaining a white man's property, and being a white man's pleasure? And better yet, how were black people considered less than human, but also the subjects for experimentation for the advancement of all of human biology? And Deidre Cooper, author of Medical Bondage, emphasizes the idea of black women being considered medical super bodies. And during the infamous Dr. Miriam Sims, during his time, women's doctors would avert their eyes and examine women's genitalia only through feeling the outside of their clothing. But when it came to black women were fully required to undress, and Dr. Sims, he once marveled, "I saw everything as no man had seen before." And this is just a surface example of how black bodies, especially female black bodies, were considered nothing but bodies. And one of the main ideas that doctors have held, even still till this day, is that black bodies, black people, do not feel pain, and therefore we can withstand symptoms and medical procedures more than anyone else can. And a lot of people know this stereotype, know this idea, and it derives from the very idea that black people weren't even human, something other than human. Dr. Cooper suggests super bodies. But the thing is, black women were still used to understand the bodies of white women and discover techniques to heal them. So how can something that isn't human be used to understand humans? Especially when it is believed that the very thing that differentiates race is the organ that they were studying, which was the genitalia. And so Deidre Cooper states that slavery, the making and remaking of blackness and otherness, and the defining and redefining of the female animal made the contradictions of medical super bodies possible, just as the social world of the 19th century could rely on black women held in medical bondage, all while whitening them in the spaces where medical men could discuss freely how to handle black women's naked bodies. The assumed promiscuity of black people was another image that was used to justify taking from black bodies, particularly those of black women yet again. And black women's bodies were dissected and put on display just for curiosity alone, remembering Sarah Bartman. And this was all okay because, like a plant that bears fruit, a black woman was always offering up her flesh. And this offering and this method at which it is taken is simply how nature has designed it. So how can you steal something from something that wants to be taken? And this idea set up the further idea that black sexuality must be controlled for the greater good. And in Tuskegee at the time of the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiments, doctors believed that black people were resistant to health measures and they were so hypersexual that the black population would eventually be completely claimed by syphilis. And it was thought that that syphilis, among many other illnesses that were prevalent in the black community at the time, was due to the lack of ability that black people had to care for themselves. Yet again, this comes up. And it became the mission of the South to ensure that black people and the consequences of their promiscuity were under control. And once again, this became the beginning of a century-long rhetoric to frame black communities as a body to be at war with. Once again, another development of the stigma. And people like Margaret Sanger, a women's rights activist, advocated for the eugenics of black people. And she wrote about a case history of a black family that led lives of hyperfecundity, prostitution, and violent crime. And she went on to say that the Negro District is the headquarters for the criminal element. And she later went on to develop the Negro Project, which aimed to provide reproductive care for black women in the form of lowering black birth rates. So the so-called science that was innocently used to explain the differences between ethnic groups very quickly led to the brutality of black bodies and the idea that blackness is so unworthy that it must be eradicated. And this idea that blackness needed to be handled didn't end in the early 20th century, and it didn't end at all. In fact, it only got stronger by using these original weak pillars of knowledge that black people were lazy and incompetent and hypersexual. And then it created the next idea that the black population needed to be something that the U.S. government was at war with. And in 1890, the New York Times and Philly Inquirer wrote an editorial that was titled, "Can Contraception Reduce the Underclass?" And they told two stories, one of the FDA approving contraceptives and one of a research organization reporting that the growing number of single mothers and children on welfare will not likely succeed. Then they asked the question, as I quote, "As we read these two stories, we asked ourselves, did we mention them in the same breath? To do so might be considered deplorably insensitive, perhaps raising the specter of eugenics. But it would be worse to avoid drawing the logical conclusion that foolproof contraception would be invaluable to breaking the cycle of inner-city poverty, one of America's greatest challenges." And the editorial concluded by linking teen pregnancy and black poverty, insinuating that it is the teen pregnancy that comes first, rather than poverty. Next, Carol Anderson, author of the book White Rage, describes the attack on a black family that had recently moved to Detroit in the 1920s. And this family was attacked by a white mob, and one of the men in that mob was killed in self-defense. And the father of this family, Osane Sweet, he was later convicted for that murder. And after the man was killed outside of Osane Sweet's home for being part of a mob outside of his home, the editor of Detroit News claimed that if the Negro would just stay in his place and quit demanding to exercise every last little right that the law gives him, then there would be peace in Detroit. And Anderson goes on to say, black flight threatened much more than the economic foundation of feudal society. African Americans' determination to achieve their full potential endangered the legalistic, biological, and philosophical tenets of a racially oppressive system. Black prosperity and success indeed, black intelligence were unimaginable. Thus, this justified the disparities in funding and education that led to abysmal schools and made the brutality of the criminal justice system necessary. And it propped up a skewed, racially based pay scale. And she goes on to further say the whole culture of the white South was erected on the presumption of black inability. And the Great Migration directly challenged that foundation. And black success was the white South's boogeyman. So during the Great Migration from 1910 to 1970, as we know, black families left the South in hopes for an escape of the South. And this is because of everything, like I said, that we already know. Black codes and just more severe segregation. And the bottom line, Anderson says, was that black economic independence was the anathema to a power structure that depended on cheap, exploitable, rightless labor and required black subordination. And when families did start to leave the South responded by banning train tickets from being sold to black people and threatening anyone who encouraged black people to leave the South. And even once people did get to the South and there was a large population of black people in the northern states, things still weren't great. There was still Jim Crow and still so much violence. And in the summer of 1919, known as Red Summer, there was a series of massacres against black people who had newly migrated to these northern cities. And just to name a few, there was a day of rioting in Washington, D.C. that ensued after a black man was accused of assaulting a white woman. Random black people were attacked at random, but many of them banded together actually and fought back. In Chicago, a black teenager was stoned to death when he and his friends swam too close to a white-only beach. This then led to a riot that resulted in 38 people dead and entire black neighborhoods burned down. And in Arkansas, white police was killed outside of a black sharecropper gathering, and this led to Governor Charles Breaux ordering Army soldiers to kill black sharecroppers of the town. And it's estimated that 200 black lives were lost in this massacre. And in my own family's hometown of East St. Louis, Illinois, just 2 years prior to Red Summer, there's another massacre. White workers at East St. Louis were afraid of new black migrants taking their jobs, and this was only made worse by the rumors that they were imported by corporations of East St. Louis to take the jobs of white unionized strikers. And they were also afraid of the voting power that black folks were starting to get. And this all led to one day where white residents in a Ford model car shot up a black neighborhood. And when another Ford model car showed up in the neighborhood a little later, the neighborhood retaliated. This led to the burning of black homes and the brutal attacks of random people in the street. And this set the tone for racial tensions of the city and nearby the city of St. Louis for years to come. And 70 years later, a 60-minute segment would capture the children and grandchildren of the murderers involved in this massacre, who are now residents at the time of Belleville, which was all white at the time. and they're afraid of black people from East St. Louis moving into the nearby town of Belleville that they lived in. And so these videos of these white residents of Belleville being fearful of black folks from East St. Louis moving into their neighborhood is juxtaposed by videos of those same people that they're afraid of, um, talking about being targeted by the police when they are going to and from work in Belleville. And so, time and time again, the issue here is freedom. The autonomy of black people is threatening to the very foundation of colonization. Even the very creation of the police force in America is the result of black people seeking freedom. Anytime black people exercise their freedom, there is a violent response that is rationalized by the knowledge that black bodies are forced to bear. And across every city, we can see how white people have used violence and policy to push black people into sections of the city of each city and across every city, we can see how white people have used violence and policy to push black people into what is known by many authors, like Joe T. Darden, as ghettos. So now I introduce my side of knowledge, the American ghetto. The imagery that comes with the ghetto is not necessarily positive, and we all know that in the United States, that the imagery is directly connected to black life and black culture. But the word was originally used to describe Jewish people that were confined to neighborhoods in the 16th century and later the Holocaust as well. But then it later became used to describe neighborhoods where black and immigrant populations lived in the U.S. And Darden describes a ghetto as an area or continuous areas of the city where more than 50% of racial, ethnic, or religious groups live due to past and or present discrimination in housing. And so I think that definition would accurately describe almost every historically black neighborhood in America. But why is everything that black people are and that black people do associated with poverty, crime, and disorganization? It might be true that many black neighborhoods suffer from an array of issues that are product of discrimination. But why does that make black culture itself so threatening to the white gaze? Why are long nails and long eyelashes and gold jewelry and ebonics and rap music and everything, why is it not only stereotyped as ghetto and trashy, but demonized, villainized? Why can't black culture be separate from the dysfunction of our communities? And to answer my own question, it's because of Francis Bernier and Thomas Jefferson and Margaret Sanger and anyone else that perpetuates the idea that someone who possesses black skin is by nature incompetent and unable to fit into a normal civilized society. And one could argue that other oppressed minorities have been able to make their way in America, but other ethnicities' entire livelihood is not attached to the ghetto. And Darden goes on to explain the crucial difference between colonized Americans and the ethnic immigrant minorities is that the latter have always been able to operate fairly competitively within the relatively open section of the social and economic order because these groups came voluntarily in search for a better life, because their movements in society were not administratively controlled, and because they transformed their culture at their own pace. giving up ethnic values and institutions when it was seen as a desirable exchange for improvements in social position. He then explains that ghettos, as they were, he explains the ghettos as they were in the 1970s, and so the book was published in 1981. Um, and so when someone thinks, especially someone who is young and black, thinks about the 1970s and black life in the 1970s, you're gonna imagine the ghetto like something that sounds like Bill Withers' Lovely Day. And kids are running around outside, double dutch and boom boxes. Old ladies from down the street are watching, selling candy and popsicles. Adults just scratching and surviving, holding tightly to the American dream that was promised to them. And yet everyone struggled, but there was community and there was love and there was hope. Black neighborhoods or ghettos were simply the definition that Darden proposes. A neighborhood that's poor and full of black folks. But at some point, the metaphorical and physical images of black areas and cities start to change and take a turn for the worse. I wanted to know more about the history of black neighborhoods in my own city, so I asked my relatives, who were older than me, of course, what their childhoods were like and why things didn't necessarily look the way that why things don't look the way that they did back then, but why they don't look that way now. And my aunts, who were born in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s, and grew up in the black areas of East St. Louis, they told me that as kids they felt safe and that they could go anywhere. And one of my aunts told me that she and her friends would go skating at midnight and catch the bus everywhere as teens. She also said that her and her friends would play outside all day, practicing the dances that they would do at their Friday after school dance. And everyone mentioned being able to take the bus any and everywhere and getting places, even as a kid and teens, with no phones or no internet. And everything was just safe and easy. And it kind of seems like I missed out, and people of my generation, we missed out on a lot. But if that's the case, then why why didn't we get to grow up in the same neighborhoods? And why does East St. Louis look like a wasteland? One part of the answer is white flight, paralleling the white residents' actions in North City, St. Louis, which created the Del Mar divide. White residents in East St. Louis did the exact same thing, and they left East St. Louis along with the businesses that were there too. And this was part to racism, but also the declining in steel and railroad industries. And there's another thing that could be blamed for the decline of black neighborhoods and black life all over the country. And yeah, that other thing is something else. In the 1960s, President Nixon started framing former President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society and affirmative action as reverse discrimination against white people, and saying things like black people chose government handouts over work. And Anderson, author of White Rage, explains that Nixon wanted the Civil Rights Act and bleeding heart liberalism to be seen as what was causing issues in America. And for his 1968 campaign, he used a video that included images of burning cities and grainy images of protesters that couldn't be identified as black. But the message was clear that whoever these protesters were the opponents of the American government. And Nixon helped paint black people as lazy and undeserving of the rights that they had fought for during the civil rights movement. But then came Ronald Reagan, and Reagan's policies quickly started to widen the economic gap between white and black people. And just when black unemployment was at an all-time high because of Reagan, he cut the budget for the training, employment, and labor services by 70%. Um, and this was responsible for programs that aided people living in inner cities. He then ordered mass layoffs against government agencies, which were the main employment for black people at the time due to discrimination. And then he also disrupted the staffing of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. But we know it does not stop there at all. In 1982, Reagan addressed the nation, explaining that a drug smuggling crisis that needed to be taken care of for American families to be safe. And he then introduced a military intelligence strategy that would cut off drugs before they even left other countries' borders. But the issue was here, drug use was actually at an all-time low. Even though unemployment in inner cities was also at an all-time low, people weren't using drugs as they were supposed to be. And here's where the real drug problem starts, though. Marxist Nicaraguans overthrew U.S. ally dictator Anastasio Somoza, and this led to the Sandinistas, a communist group, coming to power. And it became Reagan's mission to eliminate this group, because he, of course, did not like communism. And in order to do this, the U.S. needed to supply the Contras, a rebel group to the Sandinistas, that also trafficked cocaine. They needed to supply this rebel group with military equipment and training to handle the mission of taking down the Sandinistas. So, with the CIA's help, Reagan devised a plan to traffic cocaine into California's Blood and Crips gangs and use them to distribute crack to the entire American society, mainly the American black society. And the Contra's cocaine was packaged as these little rocks sold at about $230,000 per kilo, and soon enough, crack cocaine was ravaging black communities, like I said. And by 1984, the inner city blues that was once just simply a part of living in the ghetto turned into something much like war that was filled with gangs and machine guns and drug-addicted thieves running rampant. And based on the myth that crack was more addictive than the chemically identical chemical of cocaine, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was passed. The act made it so that 1 gram of crack would get you the same sentence as 100 grams worth of cocaine. This contributed to the huge disparity in the prison systems between the number of white and black inmates. And also, this twisted and sick political regime solidified the worst stigmas about black people, that our communities cannot thrive on their own and that they will always collapse under incompetence, laziness, and senseless indulgence. The crack epidemic left such a devastating impact on black communities and continued to justify the criminalization and demonization of black bodies, which only further increased the brutality that black people are still subject to. And because the CIA deliberately used black gangs to distribute this crack, crack was mainly and always has been a black issue in America. And this is what forever connected blackness to the disorganization of the ghetto. But today, when someone hears the word ghetto, they probably think of someone who talks, walks, eats, and dresses like a black person. The issue is that black people can't just be stereotyped and generalized just like every other group of people. Our stigmas have to connect to brutality one way or another. This is because of the politicians, scientists, and everyday people who continue to perpetuate the idea that blackness equals less than human. Whether deemed a superbody, a strong-willed black woman that needs not a shoulder to cry on, not a pain med, not a reparation, or deemed a super predator as a scary, brutish, animalistic criminal. Across everything that we have talked about today, the most consistent theme is the dehumanization of black people. When one is reduced to a prophet, a test subject, a spectacle, a political weapon, all personifiable. When one is reduced to a prophet, a test subject, a spectacle, a political weapon, all personifiable characteristics are not considered for what they are. And so, to answer my original question, what is created by these images? What does it result to? It results to one that needs to serve the purpose of the other. And so they cannot produce their own knowledge, and they cannot have their own identity. The only thing that we can do is detach the attributes of black life that really do make black life what it is from the original, brutish, animalistic, sub-superhuman images that were created about us to begin with.